Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Janice Esther Tulk's Cultural Revitalization and Mi'kmaq Music Making, three Newfoundland drum groups. This is a great article because it asks such a practical question. And how do we go through cultural revival? What are the ways that when we have decided two things. First, when we have decided that it is important for a number of reasons that we figure out how to express ourselves as a people. And I'm using the first person, not that I'm trying to usurp any identity, but the general question. Once we have, for whatever reasons, decided that it is important that we identify ourselves through some kinds of cultural action, how do we go about learning it? And how do we go about learning it and recapturing it when we have this interruption in that history, where it is not simply a matter of repeating what generations previous did, because the generations previous had lost it, had it taken from them, had, for practical reasons, had moved away from it, now trying to come back. And so this is about the Mi'kmaq in Newfoundland, which is its own cultural context. I mean, not simply Newfoundland's its own cultural context, but the Mi'kmaq in Newfoundland its own cultural context. The history of the Mi'kmaq people on the island is unknown. It dates back perhaps to 1760. So it's a post-contact narrative, if that's the way one dates it. Other sources suggest it goes back at least 150 years prior, which would still be on the cusp of contact. And not that contact is important, but sometimes we draw this imaginary line in the sand in that, okay, this was your ancestral territory, but 1492 or whatever, all of a sudden it's like, well, then anything after that is new and like almost doesn't count in this weird game of dibs that colonial powers have. Not that they weren't particularly respectful of the dibs that happened prior. But, and then some oral traditions have it extending back, thousands of years prior to the Beothuk. I think Frank Speck recognized that you might want to have the difference between settlement, because do you require some kind of permanent settlement, or using the territory, using the island as a traditional grounds for months on end. So you had Mi'kmaq who were coming over to Newfoundland from Cape Breton, because it isn't that radical. I mean, if you've taken the ferry, it could be interminable, but it's not an impossibility to go back and forth if you have an understanding of navigation. So when did the Mi'kmaq come to Newfoundland? The other issue was more legal, and it has to do with Newfoundland not entering Confederation until 1949, and the Indian Act not being implemented at that time. So Newfoundland Mi'kmaq didn't fall under the auspices of the Indian Act. And positively, it meant that they had the vote. Positively, it meant that, if you say positively, they were able to drink. But positively, they were treated as Canadian citizens, sort of with no distinction between no special category that they fell into. But that special category also brings with it certain privileges in terms of access to healthcare, access to education, and certain cultural supports. Again, this is not the time to investigate the pros and cons of the Indian Act, but it is a highly flawed document, but it enshrines certain rights and responsibilities. And so the Newfoundland Mi'kmaq have slowly but surely had some kind of recognition over the time, but it's not something that was immediately presented to them in 1949. So there was no community and no sort of registered reserve on in the province until 1989. 1984. And so you had these sort of two different categories. You had the sort of the status Indian, and you had band membership, and band membership in terms of living on community. So what you had there was the distinction between what comprised a First Nations person in the legal sense of the word, and what comprised First Nations person in the cultural sense of the word. Like, do they sort of have a community? So Janice is interested in drum groups, because the drum has emerged in the late 20th and early 21st century as an important part of pan-tribal First Nations identity, and particularly Mi'kmaq identity. She investigates the history of the big drum, which doesn't appear to be much of a presence in Mi'kmaq until the 1970s, the 1980s, and even less so in Newfoundland, Mi'kmaq. And that becomes that's sometimes a point of contention, because it seems to suggest, a simple reading would seem to suggest, that because something wasn't there prior to an arbitrary line in the sand, therefore it doesn't qualify as some kind of authentic tradition. But most First Nations scholars, or scholars of First Nations culture, will don't have that litmus test of sort of authenticity, because the idea is that there's much more sort of a political act. It's much less simple than it wasn't here at this time, therefore it isn't a real thing. It has been quickly adapted. It has been incorporated. Both the drum circle, the large drum, and the powwow as a practice have both been incorporated into Mi'kmaq culture in the last 40 years in a way that is, it's a new thing, yet it is contiguous and continuous with ways of music making, ways of communicating, ways of practicing, and ways of convening. So even though the structure of the powwow might be borrowed from other places, the intent of the powwow is very much in keeping, which are sort of standard folkloristic ways of looking at the world, and that we adapt because this thing fits this functional slot. And even if this thing is new, the functional slot it fits is traditional, therefore. And we're always in this process of adapting and creating and reprocessing and reincorporating and incorporating and reincorporating these new elements, because it is the consistency of the group and not the consistency of its constitutive practices that is being enacted through its culture. So she's looking at these three different groups in three different field settings. So the first group she considers is the Sivajous drummers of Conn River. Conn River is the registered community, the reserve in Newfoundland, and they have a powwow every year. The powwow was started in the mid-1990s. There was a sort of a small one, like what they call a mini powwow in February, basically to demonstrate people from off island, to demonstrate what was entailed, what was the structure, the practical elements, and also sort of the spiritual elements of the powwow. So the powwow is consistent with powwows as it happens across North America. It's usually a 3-day affair going from Friday to Sunday. The field is oriented according to the sun. It's a large circle. The center of the circle is the most sacred. That is typically where the drum is set. There are, as one sort of radiates from the center, the space moves from most sacred to less sacred. There are food vendors. There's an opportunity for conviviality. It is as much a social opportunity as it is a moment of sort of rite of intensification, of getting together, of expressing both local First Nations identity, but also it the participation in the larger sphere. And that's the two things that are important to think about when powwow, and that often that there are people from other communities who come and participate. And so to the point where there's a whole circuit, usually regionally based, a whole circuit where every weekend people might go to various powwows and perform their own performances. I'm going to sort of put a pin in the word performance for a second. And and those practices are both consistent with the sense of not simply local, but across North America, and radiating out by region perhaps, but across North American First Nations identity, while also being opportunities for forms of cultural exchange. We use the word performance, but again, within a folklore context, we should be comfortable with this idea of performance. It's a term that comes up through Janice's fieldwork, where the group doesn't, the Sipajuj drummers don't understand themselves, or don't frame what they do as performance because of the emic connotation of lacking in sincerity or lacking in gravitas or whatever. For them, it's a form of cultural exchange, a form of teaching, as it were, which is perfectly acceptable. So when I talk about performers or performances, I'm not trying to dismantle what they are saying about how they go about the world. So the powwow becomes this opportunity. So they had this Conn River one starting in the 1990s, and they wanted their own. They, being community members, wanted to start their own drum circle, thinking that it was important because they have this sense of disconnect because of the various eruptions, because of the absence of status for a number of years, because of not being part of Canada. So having whatever highly problematic sense of continuity with one's Mi'kmaq identity that the Indian Act allowed for, the Newfoundland Mi'kmaq were more on their own, which, for good or ill, more on their own, but this sense of eruption. So typically they would get this much of their revitalization, much of their what are the proper cultural forms, they would get them from the mainland. They would get them from Cape Breton particularly, and Indian River, and various communities and various particular members of those communities from across Atlantic Canada. So the article is about how you go about doing this. And one is having the opportunity to see these forms as they're done other places. So taking the idea of powwow, hosting one, and then seeing what forms are brought from outsiders and emulating them. It isn't a form of imitation, it is a form of emulation. It's like, okay, well, this is something that we could potentially do. And then what do you do within those performances? How do you go about becoming one? And the oral tradition is certainly understood as preferable. So the desire is just like learning story. One learns it through orally, through immersion. But what happens when you don't have this sort of thick level of community to pass it down? They go to recordings. They go to a number of key recordings that have happened, that have been released in, particularly in Cape Breton over the years. Two of the recordings that they learned from were the Denny family's Mi'kmaq chants and Free Spirit's Mi'kmaq songs. And these were, small, limited releases, but they were done, they were available for sale at places like Powwow, and songs would be learned from them. In order to actually perform them in public, permissions would be sought, and it's over and above the permissions of the legal system. It is about an interpersonal relationship that one has with another drum circle. It's like, may we do your song here, and a much more culturally appropriate means of getting permission. So recognizing that these are not our songs, or rather that we have gone through the appropriate means by which we can turn these things into our songs. So through often through recordings. And they did some other processes. They each member of the group, there were 10 people in the drum circle, each one would learn a particular song from a CD and then come and teach it. So this, again, already working and living in the late 20th and early 21st century, they used what was at their disposal, and they understood what was their personal preference and what was perhaps a cultural preference and what was the norm, and when they could, they would abide that. So they were able to bring people over from New Brunswick, a Randy Augustine, who taught them several songs. When people did come to town, they were able to learn songs from there. They were able to learn songs when they went to when they hosted various powwows. They didn't, because of familial commitments, because there wasn't a thick circuit for them to do it as a full-time gig. They didn't go to off island that often, so they didn't participate in many of the other Atlantic Canadian powwows. It was really only the people who were able to come over that they were able to learn from. But slowly but surely they accreted time. They actually composed their own because they thought it would be appropriate and proper to have a Conn River song, as opposed to, borrowed is not the right word, but I think we can nevertheless sort of invoke the concept of borrowing. They wanted music that was as much theirs as it was theirs particular, as it was theirs in terms of being one with the Mi'kmaq people. So you have that as one of the trajectories and one of the field sites that Janice was working on. And the second was just want to get the names right, the Aboriginal Drumming and Dancing Group in St. John's. So this was organized through a friendship center. Friendship centers being NGOs that are set up in many cities where you have a population, largely drawn by the reason that people are drawn to cities, employment, mainly employment, perhaps other cultural opportunities, educational opportunities. And so they are, but without sort of the established system of support and not only practical support but cultural support of a community. And so this opportunity to have at least some kind of touchstone in a city. Because of this, they weren't necessarily the people who participated in the friendship centers weren't necessarily all from the same First Nations. This one was predominantly Mi'kmaq, but there were Inuk there. There was the person who took over the drum circles, the lead drummer for a few years, was Anishinaabe and Cree. And Janice herself is Anglo, and was able to participate much more as sort of an ethnomusicologist, but was welcomed into the group. And so it's a different context. It is not isn't the more traditional context of life in community. And so the drum circle sort of represented that. So when the group started, they had a similar process. They had access to certain people either from Conn River, from out of town, from out of province, who were able to sort of show them the basics of how to set a practice, because practice is a form of ritual. And on top of that, they had recordings, and they were learning from recordings. When Jason Morisseau took over as the lead drummer, he introduced songs that were from outside of the Mi'kmaq canon, outside of Mi'kmaq language, and so they were including some Cree songs, but songs that were quite popular, if that's the right word, but prominent in the larger powwow circles in North America and in Canada in particular. He had this process of insisting that songs be learned orally, and which both had meant it took a while for songs to be learned, but Janice recognized that there was actually sort of a remarkable engagement once that happened, and she was able to sort of figure out that his use of hand signals, his use of repetition, was slowly able to provide its own language of instruction and conducting, so that none of the members had any kind of official training at it, and yet this training was actually the training that Morrisseau was giving them was remarkably profound, remarkably useful. In retrospect, Morrisseau himself learned much of these songs from recordings, and he wasn't being duplicitous. He had enough practice at being a drummer and being lead drummer that he was able to quickly assimilate from recordings, and then he could teach them orally. So we have this desire for culture to be taught in this particular way, in this process of not through recordings, not through books, as best we can. Someone who is able to facilitate that, while they themselves were not able to facilitate, for practical reasons, couldn't do it that way. So, okay, I will reintroduce the oral tradition process of learning, albeit I myself have to do it through these, but I already have enough oral tradition, so I'm good. Practical considerations for how to achieve something that is not simply about developing a repertoire, but developing an attitude and an ethos of repertoire and performance. And the other form, because we're not simply talking about repertoire, because repertoire is available. It is a process. It is also about how does one actually do it? How does one perform? And Janice became this interesting autoethnographic example of, with no other female voices, and Morrisseau not being able to imitate a female voice and not being able to emulate, Janice had to then go to commercial recordings or the circuit recordings and find out how a woman's voice works, because she had no model for emulation or imitation. So imitation becomes that practice. And she really recognized that when Morrisseau left, because he left. And the group, without a leader, self-regulated and figured out some things. And it was a bit of a rocky start at first, and they didn't have necessarily this is where the songs begin, this is where the songs end, but they had field recording, they had their own recordings of their own practices and that they could defer to, like, oh, okay. And they changed the process, because they didn't want to sing in they felt it a strain to sing in the higher register that Jason Morrisseau had taught them, or had sort of provided as default, and they all kind of just like dropped a couple of tones. It's like, oh, well, this is a much better range for us. So, and there's a lot of, this is an ethnomusicology and a musicology article. So there's a couple of musical terms that are just outside of my comfort zone. Well, not simply the technical language that music uses, but also the finer categories of various forms of northern and southern styles, where one is in a higher octave range and one is in a lower one. But that distinction is basically promulgated by the expectations of recording industries and circles. But basically, if you actually look at people, actually look at practices, groups will find the appropriate register for their groups, and then that's it. But that's a learning process. When you are modeling based on others, you are going to, and you have someone who has that sort of power and authority. This is no disparagement to Jason Morrisseau, but when you have that power and authority to come in and be the lead, that's going to set the agenda. But then the agenda can be adapted according to the group. And so the idea that the group figured out a new way of doing this that was much more comfortable, that felt more natural to them, that's a moment of insight that she provides. Because just because you're not doing it in the same octave range doesn't make it any less authentic. Because this is all about, how do you take this thing and make it one's own without distorting it, because it's not purely one's own, it's a cultural inheritance. The third group, and I do wonder whether she ever went back and was able to do more with this group, was the Rainbow Thunderbird Women from the West Coast. So this was a group from Stephenville. Again, they had been inspired by a visit, and Stephenville is on the west coast of Newfoundland. And it was at one of the powwows that, and she really only has this one ethnographic moment with them, where they came in and the MC, who has a very conspicuous role, asked, who was the lead, and they sort of indicated they didn't have a lead. So, oh, okay. And they didn't have the big drum. They had hand drums. And it was much more a matter of sort of a little bit of, dance isn't quite the right word, but they weren't seated around the large drum. And it was sort of individual drums. And there was 3 songs. And Janice indicates how moving people found it. And it was clearly not the drum performance that you would expect. It wasn't the large drum. It wasn't people sitting around it all sharing. It was different from. And yet the crowd clearly recognized that there was a sense of contiguity. There's a sense of continuity. There was a sense of, this is a different thing, and yet this is not a different thing. And so, the songs that they chose were not radically non-traditional. They were very respectful in terms of what they wore, and they wore sort of modest clothes. They had, clearly there was like someone there who was able to, even if they didn't have the role or the title of lead drummer, they were the ones who sort of did the end to one, end to two. They held most of the control of that performance, and yet it was clearly much more of a collaborative exercise. And it was presented as a collaborative exercise, and it was meant to be a collaborative exercise. So, as I said, I hope she's able to go back. They had yet to she had yet to establish a rapport with this group, and so didn't feel that she could, in the article, talk about this group beyond what she could observe through public performance. So that's cool, but it would be an interesting delve into how this group came to be. So the article asks these really excellent questions. You have, through cultural performance, again using the folkloristic term, you have a desire by a group, and rather by individuals within a group, to do it on behalf of their community, to participate in these cultural forms. These cultural forms that are clearly meaningful. The 2 forms of the drum and powwow, and the way that you can't really disentangle the 2, because drum is so essential for powwow is so essential for sharing and sharing drum. Neither of those forms are wholly, simply, completely, entirely, uniquely Mi'kmaq. They are, both of them are influenced from outside of Mi'kmaq, and yet they were immediately adapted and quickly incorporated into this collection of cultural forms, because they fit that slot of this is what works, and the fact that there are resonances and there are parallels with groups outside, First Nations groups outside of the Mi'kmaq themselves. And so it's like people around the continent are doing this kind of thing, and that is as much a political act as it is a cultural act. Like, okay, but nevertheless, it is done. This thing is done. This is classic folklore, isn't it? This thing is done in many different ways, but we can recognize them as parallel, and yet I do it this way. My performances here, the form that it takes here, is a thing that is nevertheless distinct. It is not unique, but it is distinct. The drum is here is not unique, but is distinct. The powwow here, etc. And so through these forms, they were embraced and adapted because they help with things like reaffirming through the joyousness that can also happen at powwow and the joyousness that can also happen with drum. We often sort of think of the solemnity of these occasions, but they are one of the things that they can be do. One of the things that distinguishes them is that they are delightful, that they are sensory experiences, that they happen outdoors, that there is fried food, that there is all the sort of things that make a festival fun, that they are immersive experiences and sensory experiences, and they're about sense and they're about immersion. So, once you've decided that that is the form that you want your cultural expression to take because it's important, and what's more, this participation is not simply a matter of self-expression, not simply a matter of creating some kind of avenue for making a identity work claim to Mi'kmaq status. There are ramifications of it, and since writing this, since this was published in 2011, it was established that one of the ways of being able to claim Mi'kmaq identity, if you don't necessarily have registration through a band, is demonstrating active participation in Mi'kmaq cultural events prior to 2011. So, which on one hand, at least it underscores the idea that participation in cultural events is a legitimizer. It's a legitimizer. It becomes a criteria. You can argue back and forth about whether that line in the sand of 2011 is justified or not, but at the very least, it enshrines the notion that one of the ways that if one wants to make a claim in other areas about a particular kind of about how you are in the world, one of the ways that you need to demonstrate that is through cultural performances. So it's an interesting thing about, or an interesting enshrinement of the value of culture. So once you have established that this is something that you want to do, once you've established that this is something that is important to you or important to your community, and therefore you are taking it up on their behalf, how'd you go about doing it? And you are a 21st century person. And so you go about doing it the way that anyone goes about doing it these days. You might have your preferences in terms of a sense of emulation, a sense of apprenticeship, a way that models the less mediated ways of learning that we can project onto a less mediated age. Nevertheless, since they are available to us, they are used, and they are used unapologetically. Recordings. Again, this was published in 2008, 2009. YouTube, online tutorials, these things become the means by which we learn, the means by which we, and again, I'm switching back to the first person, but the means by which we come to know something, because we are not limited. The folk, as I say all the time, the folk are always contemporary to their time, and they use whatever is at their disposal in order to be, in order to create, in order to perform, in order to communicate expressively. They can choose to be conservative. They can choose to limit their own criteria of authenticity, as it were. But that is that limitation is one of their criteria and is not some absolute objective necessity, because they can always change the rules. It's kind of what's amazing. Anyway, my friends, I am done. This is a wonderful article because it It is both respectful and ethnographic and grounded. It has this hermeneutic of respect that I think is important, particularly when you have non-native researchers talking about Native culture, and Janice is exemplary at that. Nevertheless, it never romanticizes. It never glosses over anything. It treats people like real people, which is always a good thing. So once more, the title of it is Cultural Revitalization and Mi'kmaq Music Making, 3 Newfoundland Drum Groups by Janice Esther Tulk. My name is Ian. As ever, I wish you nothing but the best, and be well. Bye-bye.